Throughout World War II, there were a number of men and women who were accused of spying for the enemies of their armies. If the Germans managed to locate someone who was suspected of spying, then they usually dealt with them brutally, as they would be executed very quickly. Firing squads were gathered to execute spies, but a group of women who worked alongside the French resistance for British Spy and Intelligence Network's Special Operations Executive was also brutally killed. They were taken to a concentration camp, where they were then burned alive inside of a crematoria there, and the prisoners later told the Allies about the screams they heard as each of the women were forced into the ovens. But the Gestapo would try to extract information from suspected spies, as would the Allies, and they would then also torture these suspected of espionage to make sure they got everything they needed from them. But many who refused to give over information were stated to have been lost causes, and for this they were sentenced to death and were then executed. But one man who was executed for being condemned for being a spy was Richard Jarczyk, who right at the end of the Second World War was executed for his actions. Join us today as we look at his execution, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the Second World War, the German army would lose a significant amount of soldiers and manpower on the Eastern Front. They would bring in many different soldiers from other nations that they were occupying to come to the front lines, and following the turning of Stalingrad and the heavy losses that they faced, the German army became fragmented and joined by many different people from other nations and backgrounds that were forced to join. Lots did not want to join up and fight, but they were forced to do so with the threat of violence, execution, and also being sent to a concentration camp. Lots of people were forced to join the very army that had invaded their country and caused chaos and brutality in their homelands, and resistance groups became furious at the fact patriots were being forced to join the army of their enemies. For example, around 90,000 people from Poland were forcibly conscripted into the German army. But these conscripts were also forced to conduct different roles as well as being in the military. One of these men, from the German army who was ordered to spy on the Americans in the final day of the war, was Richard Jarczyk. Jarczyk was part of the Volksgrenadier, which was a division of the German army formed in autumn 1944, following the loss of Army Group Centre to the Soviets, and also the loss of 5th Panzer Army to the Allies in Normandy. But the Volksgrenadier Regiment was supposed to boost morale, as they believed they were fighting for their nationalistic lives. There were 78 Volksgrenadier divisions created, and the loss of manpower meant that new infantry divisions needed creating, and these were mostly defensive groups who would try and dig in and hold out. The units were given submachine guns and light automatic weapons. They would be focused in close combat with the Allies. They were given weapons such as the STG-44 and the Panzerfaust to take out Allied vehicles. They were organised around hardened veterans and NCOs and also officers, and then staffed with anyone that the replacement army could get their hands on. The unemployed were involved, as were those who were wounded and were recovering, and older men who were considered too old or unfit to fight were conscripted, and the teenagers and younger men were brought in to the group. They would fight in many different battles, including in eastern France. They would defend during Operation Market Garden, and also the Battle of the Bulge. But they also saw service on the Eastern Front, and in the final battles that the Nazis faced in Europe. Some divisions were noted to have performed well, but others, it was said, were rushed into battle with little training, and because of this they had little impact on the battlefield, or they were not the most effective. But Richard Jarczyk, despite being part of the Volksgrenadier Division, ended up in the Rhineland region, which was then occupied by the Americans in March 1945. The Americans had fought hard into Germany, and the Germans tried to continue to get the upper hand over the Allies, and because of this they employed a number of spies to work behind enemy lines to try and gather intelligence regarding Allied positions and movements. There were many different spies who would work in the final days of the war, as spies behind Allied lines for the Germans. There was a Polish teenager named Joseph Fender, who was caught spying for the Americans, and despite being very young, he was shown no mercy and was executed by a firing squad. It was very dangerous at this time in the war, and Richard Jarczyk, who was at the end of the day a German soldier as part of the Volksgrenadier, was told to work behind enemy lines. He would be given a strange assignment and was told to get rid of his uniform. But then he was wearing civilian clothes, and he approached the American army, and he would offer to work for them almost as an official in helping to establish a civilian government in the area occupied by the Americans. He would want to establish some form of council, and the Americans were eager to hear what he had to say. Jarczyk was hired by the US, and it was said, in the Rhineland, a Polish Volksdeutsch named Richard Jarczyk infiltrated American lines, where he obtained civilian clothing from a sympathetic German woman, and in March 1945 got himself hired by the American military government detachment at Bruchweiler. Jarczyk was such a conscientious employee that he was soon considered for appointment as the burgomaster of the local town, although his suspicious behaviour eventually gave him away. But eventually he was suspected and was then arrested by the American forces for spying. As he was wearing civilian clothes, he was said to have been in breach of the Geneva Convention with regards to how prisoners of war should be treated. He was not in uniform, which meant that he should have been considered an enemy spy. It's not known for certain how he was caught, but his activities brought him into interrogation, and rather quickly he was then brought to trial. On the 6th of April 1945, Jarczyk was accused of being a spy, and the evidence against him was put forward at his trial, and he would confess that he had been involved in special training missions for carrying out sabotage and espionage with regards to enemy American positions. He was also found to have been collecting information about the activity of the American army, which was then passed on to one of the Werwolf groups, who would then use this to try and carry out attacks against the Americans. Because of this, he was sentenced to death, and this was just weeks before the war in Europe would come to an end. On the 23rd of April 1945, Richard Jarczyk was led out to a firing range, and he was accompanied by many military policemen. He was led towards a stake, and his arms and legs were then tied together and secured. He was wearing civilian clothes and his glasses, as well as a large hat, on his head, and a priest remained with him in his final moments, before everyone was told to back away. The firing squad made up of Americans was gathered, and they were told to stand ready with their rifles, and they raised them towards Richard Jarczyk, who was tied to the stake. When the order to fire was given, they shot straight into the man condemned to death for spying, and he was executed just weeks before the war had come to an end in Europe. There were many spies who worked undercover during the Second World War, but if they were captured, they usually went the same way, execution by firing squad. Not too much is known about Richard Jarczyk, except the fact he was a spy who was involved in gaining the trust of the Americans and then passing secrets and positions to the Germans. He was, like many spies, executed on a firing range, and he would be instantly killed by the American firing squad. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.